Hello, everybody. My name is Karen Bryla McNeese, and I am one of the dietitians at the UK Health and Wellness Program. I'm really excited to be here with you today to talk about the science of eating with self-control. At the end of the presentation today, we will have time for questions and comments, so please keep track of those and take note as we go through the information today, and I'll be happy to answer those when we get to the end. Okay. So what will we learn today? We're going to learn how to do less of this, right? We all have good intentions to resist a temptation, like this poor little guy here, but we still give in. Why do we do that? And how can we change that? That's what we'll discuss today. So how would you describe willpower? If you're like me, maybe some days just getting out of bed in the morning is a form of willpower, right? Getting up when that alarm clock says you need to get up. That can be willpower. But on a more serious note, these are some of the words people typically use to describe willpower. And in my experience, that self-control phrase is probably the most popular way that people describe willpower. How do we experience willpower, right? We talked about how we might describe it, but how does it feel to us, right? Maybe it feels like this. It feels like our brain is battling itself. We have that angel and the devil. And the devil might represent that thing that we want to do. And the angel represents that thing that we know that we should do. So essentially, our emotional brain and our logical brain are at odds. Okay. And when it comes to food, specifically, maybe willpower feels a little bit more like this. Okay. Maybe with that apple being the angel and that cupcake being the devil. When I first saw this kid, I thought, I feel ya, right? We all understand this feeling, okay, of having these choices and being torn between them, again, with that emotional brain and that logical brain at odds with each other. And that's what we're going to talk about how we can overcome today. So we talked about what willpower feels like, how we might describe it, but what do the experts say about what willpower is? How do the experts define it? It's a pretty simple definition right there. Ability to resist short-term temptations in order to meet long-term goals. Okay. Now, this really, to me, takes a lot of the mystery out of what willpower is. Okay. We're delaying what we want now for what we want later. That's a pretty simple concept. Okay. And I hope that it helps, again, to take a little bit of the mystery and complexity out of this term, willpower. Now, another definition is the ability to engage a cool cognitive system over what we call a hot emotional system. So it's kind of like those images with the angel and the devil and the cupcake and the apple, okay? It's emotion versus logic, right? That hot system is what we want now, and it's emotional and it's impulsive, okay? That cool system is rational, it's logic based, and it's focused on what we want later. So, again, that short term versus long term, that emotion versus reason. So I understand that the focus of today's discussion is willpower, but I want to emphasize that willpower is just one piece of the puzzle when it comes to making progress towards a goal. Okay, so here's our little puzzle of what it takes to change a habit, change a lifestyle, perhaps move closer towards a goal. And you see, willpower is just one part of that. Another part is motivation. So making sure you are aware of why you are trying to make a change. What is your big why that is driving you to want to make any change? Okay. You could also have another piece that is your goal, right? Of course, understanding what is it that you want to achieve? What is the end result, okay, of this effort? And then finally, observation, which we also call self monitoring. It's observing your thoughts and actions to create a feedback loop that helps you understand what you're doing, how to change it, and how to make progress towards your goal. Okay, so I point this out as a puzzle because if willpower is an area that you don't feel you need to work on, or you want to work on, or that you can work on right now, there are other pieces of the puzzle that you can focus on to still make progress towards whatever your goal is. So maybe you choose instead to figure out your motivation and your why, to figure out a specific goal and to create some feedback loops through self monitoring. This is one of my favorite things to tell people about willpower, okay? That willpower is not a magical, mystical force over which you have no control, okay? And hopefully, by reviewing those definitions we looked at in pretty simple terms, it already helped take out a little bit of the magic and mystery surrounding willpower. But I say this very specifically because, in my experience, people tend to describe willpower as something that comes and goes, right? Some days they have it, some days they don't. Okay. It seems to come and go without explanation. And that's very frustrating, right? If it's something that you're trying to use to help you make positive changes, right? But what we're going to learn today is that there are reasons, real reasons, that you feel like you may have more or less willpower on any given day or any given moment. And there are things you can do to build your willpower. Okay, so that's what we're going to look at next. Okay, so you might recognize this image as something we call fight or flight. So it's the fight or flight response, right? It's a reaction to an external threat. Okay, so this poor zebra here is being attacked by a predator. Okay, and that zebra is probably feeling a rush of adrenaline, just like we do, that floods the body with energy so that we can act instinctively to make decisions that serve us well in the short term. Okay, clearly the objective here is to get away. Okay, the zebra is not thinking about anything longer term than that, right? And we experience the same thing when we're in a fight or flight response. So, but the downside of this is that the energy we're using to act instinctively is stealing energy from the parts of our brain that are responsible for logic and reason and long-term decision making, right? That we talked about being so important for willpower. Okay. And what you're going to see is that that's going to have direct implications if we're in fight or flight for how we can use our willpower. Okay. So we're going to talk a little bit about that more in a moment. Okay. But I want to show you a contrast to this fight or flight response. Okay. And it's called the pause and plan response. Okay. And in contrast to flight or flight, this response is a reaction to an internal conflict. So we saw that the fight or flight is a reaction to an external threat. Now, pause and plan is a response to an internal conflict. Again, like that angel and devil, like that apple and cupcake, right? That's what we're talking about. You want to do one thing, but know you should do another. All right. And so you have this need for self control, which actually triggers a set of coordinated changes in the brain and body. So, actually, the need for self control and willpower is a full blown mind body response, just like the fight or flight responses. Okay. But it's a different response biologically. The changes that happen are actually going to help you resist temptation by thinking more logically and reason based and thinking about the long term consequences of your actions and your long term goals. Okay. It's basically a response that puts your body in a calmer state as opposed to that fight or flight response. So we're going to just spend one slide here talking about a little anatomy. I promise it won't be too painful. But when I was talking about that pause and plan response, and we talked about where energy goes in the brain. So during fight or flight, right, the energy is going to parts of the brain that are, again, responsible for very immediate outcomes, okay? And impulsive. Now, with pause and plan, energy is going to the part of your brain called the prefrontal cortex, all right? And the prefrontal cortex is the part of your brain that's responsible for things like planning and decision making, right? You can see there attention, behavior and judgment, controlling emotional responses, all very important for willpower, using logic and reason, and thinking long term, okay? So it's important that this prefrontal cortex gets the energy it needs and can work as efficiently as possible. Okay. So, what things does the prefrontal cortex need from you to work as effectively as possible and maximize your willpower? One, it needs a level of controlled stress. Now, I'm not going to say no stress, right? Because that's not realistic. Most of us have some baseline level of stress in our lives, okay, that we're managing at all times. But, is it under control? Okay. Or do you feel like you're constantly operating in that fight or flight response, right? And if you are feeling like you're constantly in that fight or flight response, that is going to be, like we talked about, biologically incompatible with the pause and plan response. You can't be in both. You're either in fight or flight, or you can be in pause and plan, but you can't be in both. Okay. Because they are using two different parts of your brain, right? So we need to be sure we're controlling stress to a reasonable degree so that we can access that prefrontal cortex when we need to. Okay. So if you feel like you are dealing with a particularly high level of stress or chronic level of stress, I would recommend that controlling that would be a good first step to building willpower. The next thing your prefrontal cortex needs is energy. And you get that right from nutrient dense foods. Okay. Your brain uses a lot of glucose, all areas of the brain do during all parts of the day. Okay. But your prefrontal cortex needs good energy to be able to do its work. All right. Um, so we need to be sure we're eating enough, and we need to be sure we're eating high quality nutrient dense foods that will give us sustainable energy, which is going to, again, affect the ability of the prefrontal cortex to do those important functions. And we're going to talk a little bit more specifically about nutrition in a few moments. And then finally, the prefrontal cortex needs sleep. Okay. And I know this is easier said than done for a lot of us, but the research shows that sleep deprivation, which is defined as less than 6 hours of sleep per night, this might be alarming people as I'm saying this, right? But sleep deprivation is a kind of chronic stress, okay, that impairs how your brain and body use energy. And the prefrontal cortex is particularly hard hit in this instance, okay? It's very interesting because they've actually done brain scans with people, right? To look at their brain and the prefrontal cortex activity when people are sleep deprived or well rested. And what they have found is that when sleep deprived folks catch even one night's better sleep, signs of impairment to the prefrontal cortex nearly disappear. Okay, so this shows us the importance of adequate sleep. So this lays the foundation for taking care of your prefrontal cortex, which is where that willpower and that pause and plan response is generated. So if you're looking for some ways to start building willpower, controlling stress, balanced nutrient dense diet, and adequate sleep are three ways to get you started. Now we're going to take this a little bit farther and look at some other strategies in a moment, but for anyone, this would be a really, really good place to start. So, in the research about willpower, a lot of analogies have been made to muscles. Okay. Um, the idea is that we all know with our, body's muscles, we can make them stronger, we can make them bigger, we can give them more endurance, right? But we also know that they can get fatigued with repeated use and overuse. Okay. And they define willpower in this way in the research too, right? That there are things we can do to build this willpower muscle, right? To build kind of, again, this prefrontal cortex ability, but that we have to still be aware that with too much use, it will get tired and it will be less easy to access the functions of the prefrontal cortex. Okay, so I think the muscle is a great analogy if you're, trying to visualize willpower and how it works. Okay. But we want to avoid what they call willpower depletion. Like I said, this tired muscle, right? We want to avoid that. And we can do that by, again, strengthening the muscle and using it as efficiently as possible throughout the day. Okay. So, how do we do that? And we're going to get to some of those strategies right now. So, the willpower muscle that we build is used for all tasks that require self control. So, it's not just, resisting that cupcake, it's also maybe controlling your temper when your child refuses to eat dinner, or it's maybe not buying that expensive coat you've been eyeing. It's your favorite store's window. Okay. There's a lot of ways we use self control throughout the day. And that willpower muscle is responsible for all tasks related to self control. So we have one pool of willpower for all areas of our life. Okay. One pool of willpower that takes care of, our food choices, our parenting, our financial decisions. All of those things are drawing from and using the same muscle. Okay. So the good news about that, though, is that any task we do that requires self-control actually helps us build willpower. So even if you're trying to improve your willpower, say in regards to your food choices, doing something like watching your posture during the day while you're at your desk can actually help with that. Okay. Because that still requires us to use that prefrontal cortex, right, in the brain to self monitor and to think about the long term, right? And so good posture, we know, has long term, positive outcomes, right? So anything we do that uses self control is going to build self control for all areas of our life. Okay. Some other examples might be with technology, right? That's a big area I know that a lot of people focus on now, that, they want to look at their phone less and feel kind of less, dependent on needing to look at that screen all the time. So maybe that's an area you're trying to focus on. And that will, again, serve you well in other areas of your life that require self control. They've also seen a lot of overlap between budgeting and people's financial habits and their eating habits, right? So again, it shows you that, using it in one area helps reinforce it in another area. Okay. But again, when you're practicing any form of self control, you are actually reinforcing those neural pathways in the prefrontal cortex, which means when you need to use willpower, it will be easier to access those functions in your brain. Some days I feel like this kid on here, right? It is just like one step at a time. Okay. And that is okay, right? Because we know that willpower can be depleted, it makes sense to pace ourselves when we're trying to make changes, okay, or achieve certain goals. I see this a lot, for example, when people come to us and they want to, say, lose weight, and they decide that they're going to start cooking at home more and exercising and tracking their food intake all at the same time. Okay. And that makes me a little nervous, right? Because I feel like that is likely to lead to pretty rapid willpower depletion. Okay. Most people would be better off choosing one small task or goal at a time to focus on to ensure they have enough willpower to see that through. Okay. So that is why we talk about those baby steps in small goals. And again, that helps preserve willpower to actually see these things through and not get frustrated. So, having some plan about what your day will look like can actually help preserve willpower. Okay. It allows you to plan ahead and make decisions before decisions actually need to be made. One example might be knowing you are going to have to work late and that you are not really sure how you're going to have time to make dinner. So maybe you put a dinner in the crock pot before you leave for work so you know that there will be food ready to eat as soon as you get home. And so when dinner time finally does roll around, say at 8 o'clock at night, and you're tired and hungry, you don't have to rely on your willpower now to not stop at the drive through and get a burger and fries. You've already made the decision. Okay. So this is a strategy that helps preserve willpower. If you can make the decisions before the time they actually need to be made, you don't have to rely on willpower. Okay. It is an automatic, easy choice at that point that requires little mental energy or self control. Okay. Another thing related to this is limiting the choices you have available. And so, I was talking about limiting the decisions you have to make, but limiting choices goes along with that. And as I was preparing this discussion, I came across some interesting information about some high profile folks and what they tend to do to kind of preserve their mental energy and self control. One example was Steve Jobs, who is right the former head of Apple. And if you remember what he would wear, what was he was known for wearing that black turtleneck and blue jeans all the time, right? And I read that one of the reasons he did this was to take a choice, a decision out of his day so that he could save his mental energy for other things, for more higher level decisions that he clearly had to make throughout the day. Another example I read was about President Obama. And when he was in office, he actually limited the suits that he had to choose from each day in terms of style and color, and also limited what was on the White House menu that he could choose from. And he said he purposely did this again to not have to make decisions and spend mental energy on those kinds of decisions, and he could save it for later. And I think, with that mental energy concept really means, self control and willpower too. So again, think about where there's maybe too many choices for yourself that you could pare down, so you can, again, preserve a little mental energy. Kind of related to what we just talked about, thinking about the possible obstacles and challenges that can arise during your day that might test your willpower. Okay. So maybe you can't actually make the decision like we were just talking about before it needs to be made, but at the very least, you could be planning for certain challenges and obstacles that you're likely to face, right? Maybe there are certain people you're going to have to deal with during the day, or maybe there's a certain time of day that tends to get tricky for you in terms of hunger or focus or energy, right? Maybe there's a meeting you have to go to that tends to be some kind of trigger, right? So thinking about what's going to happen that day and anticipating obstacles and challenges. This allows you to do a couple things. One, you might be able to avoid that trigger altogether. Okay. But you can also at least think about what options you might have if that trigger occurs. So here's an example. Say you are using this, then that strategy. You might say, if I go to this meeting and there are donuts there, okay, say you're going to a breakfast meeting at work. I hear this all the time. If donuts are at the meeting, then I will what, right? Now you can think ahead. Now you're not caught kind of in that heat of the moment decision. You've anticipated that this might happen, perhaps based on your previous experience. Okay, so if donuts are at the meeting, then I will choose the fruit instead. I will sit at the opposite end of the table from the donuts. I will eat my protein bar that I have at my desk. I will maybe have breakfast beforehand so I'm not hungry. Maybe I will choose to just sip on some coffee that's available, right? So by predicting what obstacles or challenges you might encounter, this allows you to plan and at least have some contingency plans about what you could do to deal with that trigger, okay? And there's a lot of power that comes in, this anticipation and not being caught off guard. Okay. This is, again, helping you to preserve willpower because you already have some sense of what you could do to deal with this trigger. So deprivation can happen on both physical and mental levels. Okay. And on a physical level, we know that not eating enough and not eating nutrient dense foods can leave your body low on glucose. And we talked about how important that glucose is as energy for your brain, particularly that prefrontal cortex. Okay. So we want to be sure, again, we're eating enough. This is often a problem we might see when people are trying to lose weight, for example. They're simply just not eating enough. Okay. And so then you are feeling you are having that lack of glucose and quick energy for your brain, but you also maybe aren't eating the most nutrient dense foods. So we want to be sure we're focusing on, high fiber fruits and vegetables, whole grains, beans, lentils. Maybe we're focusing on lean proteins, right? Lower fat proteins, more plant based proteins, and heart healthy fats like nuts and seeds and olives. Okay. So those are the basic things that we want to focus on: eating enough and eating nutrient dense things that sustain energy and keep glucose in our system longer. You can also feel deprived psychologically, right? So, again, if you are perhaps trying to lose weight or change your diet and you've been completely avoiding some of your favorite foods, okay, even if they're not nutrient dense, that's okay. You've been avoiding some of your favorite foods, you are constantly using a pretty good amount of willpower to say no to those foods and to resist those temptations, okay? And that's going to have an effect long term. So be sure that you're giving yourself permission to enjoy foods that you love occasionally, moderately, and intentionally. Okay. So we talked about that pause and plan response, right? And so we need to find ways to pause and create space between our emotions and our actions. Okay. We need time to pause and think about the short term versus long term consequences of our actions. We need to pause and allow the logic and reason from the prefrontal cortex to factor into our decision making. Okay. So I call it a mental pause button. And people operationalize this in a lot of different ways. For me, one of the most effective things is taking a few deep breaths. And I actually saw that talked about a lot in the articles I read. Just taking a few deep breaths helps you tap into that pause and plan response, get your body closer to that calm state that can access the prefrontal cortex. Okay. Some people may shout at themselves. I've heard this before, giving yourself a little shout like, hey, figure this out, right? Don't do that, right? Whatever it is that works. Maybe a favorite mantra, right? Maybe something that's calming and encouraging and empowering to you, something simple you can remember to repeat in your head. Maybe it's movement of some kind. People find it very helpful to maybe get up and move. Maybe, when you feel that, you need a pause, get up and go take a 90-second walk down the hall and back, or go up and down some stairs, or do a few stretches, right? But something that just serves as a pause, and something that you can rely on, again, to help you start that pause and plan response. And then finally, research shows that meditation and exercise can increase the actual gray matter in your prefrontal cortex. So you can actually change, the physical state of that prefrontal cortex and add mass to it, right? That's really exciting. And this makes sense, especially when it comes to meditation. Because if you think about what meditation requires, it requires discipline, self focus, attention, impulse control, self-awareness, right? All those functions of the prefrontal cortex. So it makes sense that if you're practicing meditation, you are, again, you know strengthening those neurons in the prefrontal cortex, making it easier to access it when you need it. Okay. And in the research, just 8 weeks of brief daily meditation was enough to see a change in the structure of the prefrontal cortex, more gray matter. We're less sure about why exercise helps increase gray matter, but the encouraging news with this is that a range of activities from running to yoga seem to be effective. So whatever it is that you enjoy doing from an exercise standpoint probably has a good chance of helping you increase that gray matter in your prefrontal cortex. Okay, so we're wrapped up with our willpower discussion. We'll get to your questions in just a moment. But I do want to remind you, as again, one of the two full time dietitians we have here at Eat Well at the Health and Wellness Program, a couple of benefits that you have access to. Free and unlimited one on one nutrition consultations. These can be done in person, they can be done on the phone, email, Skype, even. But it is a fantastic benefit. It is, like I said, free and unlimited, and you can consult with us about any nutrition related needs. And then also, we have something called the Eat Well program. That is a free program. It provides weekly support, accountability, and education. And we have 2 in person meetings a week, as well as an online option each week, too. And again, gives you weekly access to us, your UK Health and Wellness Eat Well dietitians. And then we also hope that you'll join us for the next Wellbeing Web Series presentation with our financial counselor, Todd McCauley, talking about a resilient retirement. And you can see there, you can sign up on your Live Well dashboard. Okay, does anybody have any comments or questions or anything you'd like some clarity on? Maybe something you expected to hear today that you didn't hear that I can try to talk about? Let's see, what is one of the recommendations you make most for people trying to strengthen willpower? You mentioned small steps are best. What would you recommend? Thank you for that question. I tend to go back to, if you remember that prefrontal cortex slide we looked at, right? And those 3 things that your prefrontal cortex needs to function properly. And I think those are the best places to start. So looking at how you're managing your stress, the quality of your diet, and your sleep. And I would say that if you feel like you're really struggling in any, 1, 2, or all of those areas, then that would be a really good place to start. Now, outside of that, and thinking about those small steps, right? Those baby steps with that slide, right? With the little kid trying to climb the big step. We encourage people to, once they have figured out, what it is they're trying to change or what they want to do, right? That goal, breaking it down into kind of micro goals, right? What is the what are the smallest steps you can possibly take, right, towards that goal? One example might be cooking more at home. That was something I had mentioned today. And that's a really big task. It sounds simple, but it's a really big task that can be quite complex and overwhelming if you're just getting started with it. So, to ensure you're, again, preserving your willpower, not having to make too many decisions at once and rely too much on that willpower, breaking it down into really, really small steps that are much more manageable. So, maybe, for a week, you say, I'm going to just look at 2 or 3 recipe websites and pick out some recipes I might want to try. Maybe the next week you make a grocery list based on 1 or 2 recipes you decide to try. Maybe the next week you try a new ingredient you've never used before. I mean, there's a lot of ways to break these goals down into much smaller steps. And I know it fights our natural instinct to want to get things done, right? But we also have to take care with our brain, right? That willpower and our motivation. And if we can even get some small things accomplished, again, that helps to reserve willpower, but it also gives us this little hit of dopamine in our brain that says, hey, we did something, we accomplished something, right? We're making progress in the right direction. No matter how small it is, we still get the same hit of dopamine and the same reinforcement and motivation moving forward. Okay, I'm glad that idea of micro goals resonates with you. And I just think it's something we don't probably talk enough about, but it is such a common problem. You're not alone, right? That people just do too much too soon all at once and they can't sustain it, right? So much of this is, again, yeah, looking at micro goals, celebrating micro progress, we call it, and being realistic with yourself and forgiving of yourself too. Those are very important things. Thanks for that. What else? Other comments, thoughts, questions? Okay. Oh, okay. We have someone saying that they really like the if then approach. So good. I'm glad that also resonates with you. Yeah, I hope that today gave you some very um, practical information. And I want you to know the information is very evidence based. It's based in science, right? It's based on your brain, which I find pretty fascinating, but also helps us, understand why we have these feelings, why we struggle, right? And what we can do about it. How would someone work to overcome willpower fatigue once it has already happened? Ooh, without completely undoing any progress. That's a really great question. That might be a good topic for maybe another one of these, right? Maybe next semester. But yeah, that is a real issue. I'd say, even before the willpower depletion happens, maybe recognizing what the signs of that are. Okay. Understanding that maybe you are um, finding it harder and harder to resist temptations. Maybe you are, again, thinking about other areas of your life that need willpower, right? Maybe you are, being less patient with your children at home or in your relationships, or maybe your spending habits have gotten a little bit out of control, right? I mean, there's lots of signs that maybe that willpower depletion is happening. So looking for it in all areas of your life, right? But I'd say, I tell people you got to go back to the basics. As soon as you feel that fatigue set in, right, that willpower depletion, go back to basics. Go back to those micro goals and the micro progress, right? Because that's probably something, if you're feeling that fatigue, something that's gotten away from you, right? So go back. Go all the way back and start at the beginning again. Start simple, okay, and build from there. Let's see. You're welcome, Kara. Another Kara, maybe it was mentioned earlier, but I would love to know what apps folks use and have had success with for managing self-care. Oh, wow. I'm hoping maybe some folks here have insight into that, because I unfortunately do not. Although, Kara, I'm happy to make note of that and maybe get back to you after doing a little bit of research. But is there anyone here that uses any apps related to these concepts? Okay. Well, please send them to us if you do. You can continue to use this chat box, but we are going to, for the sake of time, wrap things up today. But I do really want to thank you for being here. There was a lot of interest in this topic, and I do hope that it gave you some very useful tips going forward. So we'll look forward to seeing you again at a future event. Thanks, guys.